on Rowan Radio 89.7 WGLS FM. Today, our special guest is Tony Levin, probably the greatest bass player that potentially you've never even heard of. Tony's been playing bass for several decades. He's played with bands that feature in our sets very regularly, King Crimson, Peter Gabriel, and many other bands as well. And he's toured with several other acts, including Dire Straits, Todd Rundgren, Yes, Warren Zevon. The list goes on and on. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. You're definitely one of the musicians that matter. Can you tell us a little bit about your history, where you were born, and when you picked up the bass?
Sure. I'm from Boston, Mass. And when I was a kid, I was a classical music fan. I was way into it, and I picked up the bass at a young age. By the bass, I mean the what's now called the acoustic bass, or the upright, or the contrabass. And that's what I played through my youth in high school. And I went to music school in Rochester, the Eastman School of Music, at which point I started playing jazz and rock. And at some point, I'm one of those people, I'm lucky I was immersed in what I wanted to do, which was classical music. I was immersed in it so much as a youngster that I actually kind of got tired of it by the time I was in the Rochester Philharmonic at a young age. Maybe I was 20 or 21. And I could see that I really had gone as far as I wanted to go, and I became much more interested in jazz and rock. I played jazz for a short time, a couple of years, and I liked it, but I just kind of gravitated more towards rock, especially after I got rid of that upright and got an electric bass. That helped a lot. And then I went to New York City and became what's called a studio player. Actually, I didn't want to, but I fell into that profession. And as soon as I got a chance to leave that and go out on the road with some rock bands, which I did with Peter Gabriel and then later with King Crimson, I found what I really love to do, which is play live with rock bands. And since then, I've done a lot of touring. I've also been lucky and done a lot of recording, although I'm not just a studio player anymore. I don't sit around New York going from studio to studio the way I did back in the 70s. And if I get a chance to play with some of my rock idols like David Bowie or Pink Floyd, then I'm just Dire Straits, whom you mentioned, then I'm a pretty lucky guy. So there's my history.
Yeah, that's quite an accomplished history. How did you the first time I had heard of you originally was when Peter Gabriel left Genesis, I guess, 74, 75. I was a young person, quite young as a matter of fact, and he went out on his own, I can do this better, I can do this differently. And how did you get hooked up with Peter Gabriel?
Through luck, the way things happen a lot in the recording business. The producer, Bob Ezrin, was a producer who had used me on a number of rock records before. Those recordings that I did with him were with Alice Cooper, and one was Lou Reed's Berlin, a kind of famous record. So, Bob had this new client, a new artist. He was not a new artist, but a guy he was really producing, Peter Gabriel. I didn't know Peter. I didn't know Peter's music, and I was just the guy asked to the sessions. The sessions lasted about a month. We did them in Toronto. And I hit it off great with Peter, both musically and personally. And amazingly, I've been with him ever since. That was in 1976, and actually I'm still in the band. So it's a good thing we hit it off well. We had a lot of future together. And I could tell right away when I heard his music that he wrote and performed in a special way, really not like anybody I had heard before. And so that it was fun for me to relate to that as a bass player, because I like to play bass in different ways than I've done before and try to break a little boundaries with my bass parts, and it seemed really ideally suited to his music, at least to me. And obviously he was happy with me. And that first tour we did, probably still in 76, with his first solo album was called Peter Gabriel. He actually made the mistake of calling his first few albums Peter Gabriel. They all have the same name. And we did a wonderful tour, and it just became apparent to us both that I would be staying with him, and that I enjoyed the band and touring with him. And I kind of cut back on my studio work after that, and did more touring than studio recording.
Yeah, it seems that Peter Gabriel kind of had an all-encompassing way of producing things. Before the age of multi-track digital recording, I don't know, what you actually had in the studio, but in the early days, you kind of ping-ponged back and forth in an analog way and used multiple recordings to try and re-record. And unfortunately, the more you did, the more noise you added. But having said all of that, on Peter Gabriel's websites and the things that he's released to the public, he's released some of the tracks and things that originally he used, and it seemed like he had done many, many tracks and takes and different voices and even some odd things to just make noise that he thought would be helpful to the recording. How was that process for you?
If you're talking about the first recording, then I wasn't aware of it at all. I wasn't aware of it at all, and that was pretty much directed by Bob Ezrin, the producer. Subsequently, Peter built his own studio and became more in charge of things, and I wasn't the guy doing it, but I was around when they were doing it, and I watched them do that. It was early use of sampling, and I'd be staying in England for the month or a couple months to record, and supposed to start in the morning, but Peter would be at a trash dump recording garbage being thrown around, which then later he would slow down and make a bass sound out of it. And he'd say, hey, maybe you can use this on this track, and really creative stuff like that. So I wasn't really instrumental in any of that, but it was kind of going on around me. Even back in the first recording, I think they wanted to have the drummer or the synthesizer, which in those days you kind of couldn't do. There were no electronic drums. They kind of figured out a way in the studio to do that. And so actually it was pretty groundbreaking right from his first solo recording.
Right.
He's gone far beyond what I even know about, because typical of the rhythm section, we're in there in the early stages. The first Peter or the artist writes the song, and then you have the rhythm section, the bass and drums in there, and a guitar player. And then with Peter, as much as a year or two could go after that when he's overdubbing other things and doing the vocals, and I'm not really privy to that. I'm off doing something else. So it's a thrill for me when I hear the record come out, because I'm going to hear a lot of things I didn't hear way back in the rhythm tracks.
Well,
and who knows what he got into and all that type. Some pretty amazing stuff.
Right. The first four discs, I think, which I know I had and I coveted, were Peter Gabriel, Peter Gabriel, Peter Gabriel, and Peter Gabriel, and some of us, and I guess some people at the record companies were probably terribly uncomfortable with that, and we would even call them by the picture on the front cover, or some word like the one with Shock the Monkey on it. Peter Gabriel 4 was, they either called 4 or they called Shock the Monkey, or, they called it Security. And I don't know, I've never had the privilege of asking him why it was called Security, but, but there was never anything
I never
there.
asked myself, so I don't know. Yeah, well, Peter's always creative and always finding different ways to do things, and you got to love that. And also he's had a remarkable arc in his career. He didn't just musical arc. He didn't just keep playing the same kind of rock he was playing and writing when he left Genesis. He really has pushed himself to go beyond that on each recording. So you get a remarkable span of musical styles that all have something in common with Peter. But he's not afraid to tackle having African rhythms in his music, which was pretty unheard of in rock when he did it. And like you said, the digital use of digital things and sampling that wasn't done before.
Right, and you had mentioned that originally you took up the upright bass, you played classical, and then I guess you played a conventional electric bass when you were a session player in the 70s. At what point did the Chapman stick, or the stick, as it were, which is kind of your trademark sound and appearance for anybody that has seen you, when did the stick come to be for you?
That's a good question. Obviously, you've done your homework to know that. It's called the Chapman stick, invented by Emmett Chapman, a man who invented it and still manufactures it and lives in Los Angeles. Stick.com, by the way, I think is the place to find out about it on the web.
Go.
So in the 70s, I heard about this instrument. It was a pretty real new instrument then. And because I liked to play the bass in, and I knew, I don't know how much I want to go. The stick is played by hammer-on technique or tapping. In other words, instead of holding the string down with your left hand and plucking it with a pick. You just hammer it down with your left hand, and you hammer another note down with your right hand, or tap it. So I had been playing the bass in that technique for a while, and when I heard about the instrument, I thought, well, this could suit me, and I got it, and actually brought it to the session I mentioned in '76, the first Peter Gabriel solo album, and it didn't work out on that, but I took it on tour with him, and gradually since that time, I've used it as one of the basses I have, and at first I only played it as a bass because it has bass strings and it has guitar strings, and gradually through the years, I guess more people who used me knew that I could get that sound and asked for it. And of course, inevitably through the years, I began to play the top side of the stick, especially in King Crimson, which could also always use more notes. And eventually, I came to write my own music mostly on the Chapman stick because it's very versatile for writing music. And a few years ago, I formed a group called Stick Men with another stick player and a drummer. And to this day, that's pretty much most of the touring I do lately is with Stick Men. We have fun. And with two guys playing tapped instruments and a drummer, especially this drummer, you can cover really a lot of ground. It's really having a trio, three guys, is enough. But when it's two sticks or stick-type instruments, you can both play bass and both play guitar sounds at the same time. And the drummer, Pat Mastelotto, is the drummer from King Crimson, and he plays electronic drums as well as acoustic drums, so he can be playing acoustic drums but also throw in loops and samples and stuff like that. So we sound like a pretty big, powerful band, which is great to be able to do with three guys.
Right, so you've got, let's see, you're each at least two instruments, so that's 2, 4, at least 5 instruments.
Yeah, in itself, it's handy, but in itself, that doesn't make the band any good. Obviously, you have to play the stuff well, and you have to pick good parts to play. But yeah, it leads to, I'll put it this way, it leads to more versatility. And I actually like being in bigger bands, but nowadays, with the economy of touring, having less guys makes it possible to take gigs you would be otherwise not able to do. So we can do more gigs because there's only 3 of us.
Right, and that's all good. And I'd like to get back to some of your current stuff in a moment. In the late '70s and early '80s, when you said you kind of had caught the eye, I guess, of Robert Fripp of King Crimson, and later on Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe, when they had reformed Yes, but not really Yes. So because Chris Squire wasn't in it, so it was Yes.
Correct.
It was mostly Yes-ish. And I remember seeing you on that tour as well, and I noticed that you had invented something new, like the stick, which you kind of brought to popularity from my viewpoint. You had also brought something called funk fingers. Can you tell us about those?
Well, yeah. For a minute, I was wondering what you were talking about, but of course, I forgot about that.
Well, as long as I'm right, we're good. Go ahead.
I'll tell you the story from the beginning, because it's not that long a story. On one of Peter Gabriel's tours, on one of his recordings, on the piece called Big Time, when we were recording it, I thought it'd be cool to have the drummer play on the strings of the bass and me do the fingering with my left hand. So we did that piece that way, which was fine. But then when we were touring, I was having trouble, as you can imagine, playing that piece without the drummer there next to play on the strings.
Sure.
So I was always at soundcheck. I was always practicing with a drumstick in my hand and just trying to work that thing out. And one day, Peter himself walked by me and kind of looked at me and said, "Well, why don't you try to figure out a way to attach drumsticks to your fingers?" So actually, it was Peter's idea.
Wow. And
I used the technical help of my bass tech at the time. His name is Andy Moore, and because I didn't have a clue how to do that. And eventually we worked out a way with very kind of thin drumsticks and with elastic stuff wrapped around it, and I refined it a bit, because if the sticks were too thick, they would break the strings. If they were too thin, they would bounce too much and things like that. If the elastic was too tight, my finger would turn purple. If it was too loose, the thing would go flying into the audience in the middle of a lick.
Nice.
And I worked it out, and I thought that was great. I just had 1 or 2 pairs. And sometime, I'm not sure what year this was. It was back a while, but at some point I thought it would be nice if the whole bass community has these things and see what they can do with them that I wouldn't. And so when I first, this would have been in the mid-'90s, when I first formed my website, I started it out by selling funk fingers for $10, and that was fun, and people bought them, but the guys got tired of making them, and kept not hearing anybody play them, so I stopped being in the silly business of manufacturing funk fingers, and just continued to play them. When I joined what had been called Yes, and it was Anderson, Bruford, four guys from the original Yes, and I was called upon to play the great bass parts of Chris Squire. I didn't want to just play them the same as or try to play them the same. They're hard enough to play. He played with a pick. He played them with a pick, these famous parts, and I thought, well, this is a perfect chance for me to really woodshed and get better with the funk fingers and play these parts with fingers and get better at my technique. So I did, and ever since then, I think it's another thing I can bring to possibly using on the bass. It depends on the track and on the music I'm hearing, but I get to play them sometimes. Even on that tour you're talking about with Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman House, I pretty much use them the whole show, so it was kind of a showpiece for the funk fingers.
Right, and I think also you hung on with them for what, Union for the tour? Is that right?
Say that again?
You hung on with Yes for the Union tour when everybody got back together, Yes East and Yes West, and they...
Not at all. No, once they got back together with the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman House, for those who don't know, he did an album called Union, which I played on half of, and it had the two versions, the version of Yes called Yes, with Trevor Rabin and Chris Squire, and the album had them, and the other half was us. But once they toured with Chris Squire, indeed playing the bass part that I was trying to cop that he had done, they didn't need me anymore, so I was not on that tour.
Oh my gosh! Okay, well, was that a time for you to reacquaint with King Crimson, or what time was that for you?
I'm trying to think, because I'm not too good at years. I think that was in about 1990 when King Crimson was in let's call it a hiatus. What happened is we sort of had broken up and were later to reform. That happens with bands sometimes. Pretty much I was in King Crimson from 1981 to 85 or 86, and then we started again in 94 or 95 or so. And actually then for a short time in the year 2000 or 2001, there was a tour I couldn't do because I was committed to tour with somebody else, and so I wasn't in the band for a few years. And then I was in the band again. And actually I'm in it now, but we don't do much. Actually, we don't do anything. But should we do something, I'll be in it, and I'll be thrilled to get that call. I would love to tour and or record with King Crimson again.
Yeah, how was it to work with Robert Fripp, perfectionist that he is? We had the privilege of talking to Greg Lake, who was with the original King Crimson for all of one album before Emerson, Lake and Palmer came together, and it was quite a story and fortune there, certainly. And Greg is actually still out touring. Keith Emerson had toured with him about a year ago, and they just did some things. It was a fun tour to see. What was Robert Fripp like to work with?
Oh, I've been asked that a lot. He's a good friend of mine and kind of a musical inspiration, so I have nothing but good stuff to say about Robert. He's unique, and he has his own ideas about how music should be done and touring should be done. And he's kind of not like everyone else in that respect, but it's a way that has worked out really well for me. We respect each other musically a whole lot, and so both creating music and coming up with ideas, in my case, coming up with bass ideas for the pieces that he's written for King Crimson, that works well for us, and I always have the feeling that he likes what I've done and respects it, so we get along great.
Oh, very good. And I also understand that you've also gotten together intermittently with your old bandmates from Peter Gabriel, Jerry Marotta on the drums and Larry Fast on the keyboards.
Yes, for a few years I was touring with those guys. I called it the Tony Levin Band because I put it together, for lack of a better name, and that was great fun. We're great musical buddies, and we're all buddies too from all the years we spent touring. I just can't do all the bands that I can imagine, so I had to let that one go by the wayside when I started touring with Stickmen. And that's not to say that I won't someday bring it up again. It was more than just Jerry. Jerry, by the way, Jerry Marotta is a neighbor of mine who lives nearby in Woodstock, and we record and jam together a whole lot. In fact, I think in a couple of days I'm going to jam at his birthday party. And Larry Fast, not too far away in New Jersey, so these are guys I can play with pretty often just for fun, and that's a great thing.
Well, you guys had a great chemistry with Peter Gabriel. I mean, I'm sure Peter Gabriel was a lot of the talent and things as well, but you guys had quite the chemistry.
You're right, and I agree. It felt very much like a family, and it did have chemistry, and And Peter's shows always have been great. They were great in a different way back when that was the band. There was a lot of, I won't call it ad-libbing, a lot of just surprise things would happen on stage, but done with a show that Peter had set up, a technology show that worked in that context. In later years, the technology of the show got more advanced and even better. It got great, but there became less. How should I put it? Just kind of less flexibility in what the band can do. Of course, musically you can do what you want. You're playing it.
Would you say improvisation?
Well, it's when the lights are prearranged and they have a trick thing that they're going to do or a staging thing they're going to do. You have to be in the right place when they do it. You can't just be running over, kicking the other guy in the butt just for a joke.
Right.
So the old days when Peter used to come over next to me and step on my pedals as a joke and make me bend down and plug them in again and things, and then I'd get back and things like that. It was kind of a different kind of band. It's amazing that what's remained consistent is it's still a really great show to watch, and the band is still having a lot of fun doing. Probably the most fun I've had in my life was doing Peter Gabriel shows. So it's great. I just kind of got off on this thought of how it was different and more of a kind of out of control band with some great showpieces happening back in the old days when it was Jerry and Larry. And Tim McGinnis was the guitar player then, and then later David Rhodes, who is still in Peter's band. Great bands, great players and great guys in that band.
Well, we'll have the privilege of speaking with Larry Fast at some point. Is there a message you'd want to send to him?
I think I can tell him my own messages, but I think you should have him. He's a fascinating guy, and he's super aware of all the technology things that Peter did in the old days, because Larry was very instrumental on that. Especially when I mentioned them going to the garbage dump to record things, he was there, and he'll tell you what they recorded and how they did it.
Yeah, that sounds like
great.
No, I appreciate that question. So, fast forwarding a little bit, with your activity with King Crimson, where people picture you, with Yes, where people picture you, and with Peter Gabriel, where people picture you. Tell me about Stickman a little bit.
Well, like any guy who loves making music, I do my own solo albums and have for a long time, and have my website to actually, I decided to sell them on the website before many people were doing that. It doesn't mean I did well at selling them. It just means I was kind of interested in bypassing having a label, and I like the idea of putting them myself. So I kind of have a long history of having a presence on the web with the website and fans knowing to go there. And I'm lucky that I can take advantage of that to when I have a new record that I can put it out in a decent way and get enough sales to pay for it, which is the objective nowadays. So I've done a lot of different kinds of records, and I guess a few records ago I did one called Stickman, not Stickman, but Stickman, where I focus a little more on the stick. And instead of putting usually I put a bunch of great musicians together, or I write the music and we do the album, and that's the album. And in this case, I thought I'm going to just really play a lot of the stuff myself and then add a few guys. And I liked the way it came out a lot. And then it came out, and I was stumped with how I can play it live, because it had more than one stick part. That hadn't occurred to me when I played it. Because my band at that time with Larry Fast had a synthesizer player and another keyboard player and great guitar player, but no stick player but me. And so when the chance came, I decided to form a band, like I said, a smaller band, a three-piece band. And we started by just playing the music from that album, Stickman, but pretty soon we wrote other music, and there was some, as will happen with bands, there was a change in personnel, and now the other stick player, his name is Marcus Reuter. He's a great player, but he actually doesn't play technically a stick. He plays a touch guitar, which he built himself. He knows of the stick, and he preferred to build one himself and have it be the way he was. Wow. And then, as I said before, Pat Mastelotto of King Crimson, we play pretty hard-edged progressive rock. We can easily do King Crimson music, which we do for the fans, because, as you would imagine, some of my people who come to our shows are King Crimson fans.
Right.
And actually, right now, we're in the middle of, and I mean literally in the middle of recording the new album. We're going to tour a lot in the spring and in the summer and in the fall in Europe. And we need to have a new album for that, and we're about three-quarters done with it, but not done. So Marcus lives in Austria, and he came to my house in New York State last 2 weeks ago. We spent the week writing more material, and when I get off the phone, I'm going to plug everything in. I've just been in Japan, not home. I'm going to plug everything in my studio and get going on improving that material before we finalize the way it should be and re-record it for the final album. So it's a group. I have a lot of fun with it, and you never know predicting the future in rock, but I would think that Stickman will be a part of my future for quite some time.
Oh, that's terrific, Tony. And again, I appreciate you making time, especially with your touring schedule and being back from Japan, and that's super. If somebody wants more information, your website is Tony Levin, TonyLevin.com. What would you recommend for someone to get a handle on what Tony does? What piece of music, what article should they buy? It's incredible the amount of things you've done, the progress through progressive rock that you've had. How would you say, oh, you want Tony Levin, here's what to look at?
Well, thanks. Ironically, I've never thought of that. I would probably say the best thing is just to go to that website, TonyLevin.com. If nothing else, the first thing you'll see is a diary of what I'm doing. If I've been on the road, then I'll have pictures up from backstage, and I love taking pictures of the audience. I was thrilled back when I started the website, and I realized that I can take a picture of the audience, and at that time, a couple days later, now it's a couple hours later, I can show them what they looked like on the stage, which is really cool because audiences are really inspiring to those of us on stage, and they maybe don't realize that, and it's a good thing to be able to share with them. So that's the first thing, the road diary, and then there's archives there with pictures from all the tours I've done. Gosh, I don't know how much. It seems like there must be thousands of pictures from dozens of tours, maybe even, no, I wouldn't say hundreds of tours, but dozens of tours with people like Peter Gabriel and King Crimson, but also Seal. I toured with Seal, and I'd have to turn on my own website to see who the tours are with. I tour with a jazz band called L'Image, with some great players, and I think someone could look around the website and find something to interest them.
Great. Well, again, I appreciate that, Tony. Thanks again. You've been listening to Interviews with the Musicians That Matter right here on Rowan Radio 89.7 WGLS FM.